Hello and welcome to the Greenburgh Student News Network. I'm Blake Feinstein, and I'm a student at Edgemont High School.
I'm Callie Weintraub, and I'm a student at Ardsley High School. Today we're interviewing Jordan Copeland, the village historian of Scarsdale, New York.
His work includes thoroughly researched videos on the history of Black people in Edgemont and housing discrimination in Greenburgh, as well as almost a dozen historical interviews with locals.
Please welcome Jordan Copeland. As the town historian of Scarsdale Village, so how did you get that job?
So, go back a few years. I was teaching fifth grade in the Bronx, and we did a project on when the school was built, what things were like. So we did a big diorama and went out and I did historical walking tours. We went with the Bronx Historical Society and did all this great stuff, so comparing then and now. So what happened after that is I got kind of the local history bug from that, because when I was little, I wasn't particularly interested in history because a lot of this stuff in schools I couldn't really connect to. Like the stuff, ancient Egypt, it's very interesting, but I didn't see how that connected to my life. So we did that at school. I started looking at my house and my street and my neighborhood, and I started learning all of these things about it, and I figured I might as well share that information if I had it. So I put on Facebook that I was going to be doing a walking tour of the neighborhood, and like a whole bunch of people showed up. And it was great, a lot of fun, answered all these questions. And then maybe 6 months later, I put it up on Facebook again, and like more people showed up, and it was really great. So then I started researching other parts of town. Then the Historical Society asked me to become involved with them. And then the village asked me to be the associate village historian. And I was just kind of doing a lot of stuff sort of on my own a little bit, but then as historian and as associate historian, I did more. And then I became officially the village historian a few years ago.
Wow, that's amazing. So as the village historian, what does the job entail, and what's your kind of day-to-day life like?
So it's a part-time, unpaid job, and basically you could put it into two big buckets. There's stuff coming in and there's stuff going out. So what part of my responsibilities involve collecting important information, collecting historical information, what could be historical right now or will be important at some point. So that might be trying to gather information, going through records, talking to people. Sometimes people have photos in their attic. Sometimes people write with an email about an inquiry, and I follow up with them and I find out if they have something, because for all the historical stuff we have, there is surely 50 times as much in people's attics or basements, and at some point their kids will get it and maybe throw it away. So I'm trying to collect as much information on the one hand. Then on the other hand, it's presenting. So traditionally that was writing. Today, I don't think that's how most people get their information. I think more people get their information from watching videos and things like that. So I'll do presentations, I'll make videos occasionally, or I'll just do a presentation and video it and put it on YouTube, and then people can watch it.
Amazing. So as you mentioned, when you were younger, you didn't really have much of an interest in history.
No.
So what kind of sparked that interest as you grew older?
In one sense, it does seem to be inevitable. That it seems like the younger you are, sort of the less you are, and the older you are, because if you look at the audiences who come to the Historical Society in my presentations, they tend to be of a certain age. So it might just be something that naturally happens as you start to put things into context and you've seen things change. And part of it for me was understanding that just the local history as opposed to larger global stuff, because I still like stuff about ancient Rome, ancient Greece is really interesting, but I have difficulty following the thread that comes right to me. Whereas if I think about the person who lived in the house before me and the person who was in the house before them, and I look back in the census records and I see what the people did who were in my house in the 1940s, that somehow I can connect with that and it resonates with me more.
I agree with that. I think when you have a personal connection, it definitely makes learning more interesting, and especially with the history of your personal connections. So besides history, do you have any other interests that you like to pursue?
So if I could back up, I was a public defender in the Bronx for a decade. I taught fifth grade in the Bronx for 7 years, so I'm still interested in those sorts of things. I am the president of the Scarsdale Library Board. I love being involved with the library. It's a really great place. A lot of great people working there, librarians and all the staff. Great programs, all sorts of awesome things like that. I'm involved with the Scarsdale Adult School as well. And personally, I make music. I'll write, record, perform music. I play a bunch of racket sports. I'm a decent platform tennis player. I'm a very good pickleball player. So I like doing a bunch of different things in my day. And so the historian gig kind of fits into that nicely because it's not a 9-to-5 grind.
That's amazing. What kind of music do you play?
I mean, I play guitar and I sing. I guess you could throw it into like the general singer-songwriter thing. But I've got, I mean, if you want to know, I'm literally not making a plug, but there's all this stuff up on Spotify. So if anybody wants to, they can always check it out under my name.
So what do you think the significance of history is and why it matters, especially in our local area?
Callie, that's a great question because, things change and things don't change. And there are issues that are particular to our local areas, and then there are issues that are really American issues and things like that. And you see the same sorts of things echoing through. One of the biggest examples that you would see in both Scarsdale and Edgemont and everywhere, is that who lives in a neighborhood, who lives in a community changes, often from ethnicity, right? So if today there has been in both of the communities many more people of Asian descent coming in, and people might think, oh, that's something new. Well, in previous decades, you had the exact same shift with, say, Jewish people coming into a community, into both the communities, where previously they had a much lower presence. Now they're coming in, and you might have similar reactions. And I'm not saying that they're negative or positive. They might be welcoming, or they might be curious, or whatever it is, but that you have things change. You need to integrate and welcome the people who are coming in next. So, it's that sort of thing. And it's just like, there's also things that go forward and there's go backward. And one of the things that really interested me when I started looking into Black history in our neighborhood, one of the things that interested me when I started looking into Black people in both of our communities was that in the 60s and the 70s, and a little bit into the 80s, there were many more conversations about race, I felt. And you looked, and there were efforts made to attract Black people, and there were efforts made to find out what the barriers were and deal with them. And I didn't, a few years ago, notice as many of those conversations happening. It seemed like a much more kind of laissez-faire attitude of, you have the money, you want to come in, you're welcome to come in, but not looking at, well, what might be some of the structural issues that are making this not as inclusive a place as you might like to say.
You mentioned that you, a couple years ago, noticed that people weren't really addressing the issues and being as accepting, and how, did you notice that change?
With the murder of George Floyd, I feel like conversations started changing. And even though that was an issue of police brutality, I think it did start conversations happening about who are your neighbors, who do you have empathy or not have empathy for, and trying to push forward. Now, we're in a position right now where a lot of the low-hanging fruit is gone. We don't have segregated buses and things like that. You can change that. That's easy. Just let people sit where they want. That's people's expectations and prejudices, but that's not something that seems particularly difficult to solve. Mm-hmm. The issues that we have now are a little bit larger and structural and harder to solve, and require more of a commitment both from a local community and from a national perspective.
Your research on the history of Black people in this area starts around the 1700s. Mm-hmm. And in this photo of the 1790 census, there were 616 white people, 122 enslaved people, and only 9 free people of color. So what does that mean for that time period? Why is it significant to sort of look at this sort of artifact?
Yeah, I find this sort of thing incredibly useful in that when I was in school, slavery was a Southern thing. We would kind of point fingers down there, talk about the Civil War and stuff like that. And the North was on the right side, the South was on the wrong side. But that's not the case. Slavery was thriving in the North. It was thriving in New York, and places like Westchester depended on the efforts of enslaved people to function. So what you see from the census records is you see that the vast majority of black people were enslaved, not too many free, but there were some people who were free, and that's useful to know. And it also identifies who the enslavers were. And you start getting into issues that I think open up useful conversations about the past, how you should look at people, because there are, for example, in Scarsdale, there are streets named after people who are known to have enslaved people, and I'm sure the same is true in Edgemont. You have Odell and Underhill. What does that mean? What does that mean about their legacy? How do you look at that? I don't think it's a simple thing. I don't think it's the same as a Confederate monument where most people would just say tear it down because it kind of glorifies something that we don't like. But I think it's useful to think about, and it's helpful to know the main point. It also happened here, and as you look around, you could look at, for example, a really old stone wall somewhere. That stone wall could have been made by enslaved people if it's old enough, which is
really
incredible.
Interesting. So yeah, you've researched several like specific locations that have ties to slavery. For example, like there's a house on Old Army Road that you mentioned. So what's the story with that?
So there's a house on Old Army Road, and behind it is what's now essentially a storage shed, but it's been documented as having housed enslaved people back in the 1700s, which is remarkable. So this slave quarters is fairly unique. There are not a lot of these still around, and you see it's quite small. There would have been a sleeping loft on there, and the number of people who lived in there was a lot. But it gives you color about what were their lives like, how did they live, living in an outbuilding. The way enslaved people lived in this area was different than the South. We don't have big, large plantations of monoculture, cotton, tobacco up here. What enslaved people were doing in the North was much more varied. They had a lot of different skills, and they were making a lot of different things happen. So there's some way that you can look at that with respect for the skills that they had.
Really interesting. In the rural period, I know you've researched the Stewart family.
Yes.
So what was so interesting about that piece of history?
I really enjoyed learning about the Stewart family because it's just great to learn about a black family with such detail. We have a bit more detail looking in the census records and looking in draft cards and some photographs and other sources. This is a picture of Charles and Louis Stewart as children. They were a very engaged family in the Edgemont community, went to school with the other kids, and they lived at Fort Hill Road. Then later, Louis wound up buying land around right off of Old Army Road. They attended Greenville Reformed Church. And there's a fascinating detail about Louis that he later became a member of the Greenville Fire Company. Oh, wow. And they had to change the bylaws of that because the bylaws previously said that the fire company was only eligible to men who were free, white, and 21. And they changed that for him because he was apparently popular and liked and certainly could contribute as a fireman. So they were sort of welcomed in that way. One of the reasons that this is more significant to me is that later you hear about instances in the suburban era, which I would classify as, say, 1900 and later, where black people were not welcomed into the community. And for me, I always grew up thinking that sort of progress moved in one way. And this seemed to be a step back, that you had people who went to school and had homes, volunteered, part of the community, and then all of a sudden now there's a different attitude of saying, well, you're not welcome here.
Yeah.
And it was curious to me, distressing, and curious to see why things were moving in what seemed to be the wrong direction. And the reason for that, as illustrated by the case of Joshua and Pauline Cockburn, was that people were concerned about, quote, property values. That the Cockburns, they bought land in Edgemont in 1932, they built their home, and then in 1937, they were sued by their neighbors because there were covenants, and racially discriminatory covenants were at that point still legal. They were legal until 1948, when the Supreme Court said they were unconstitutional. And that said that there was something in the deed that said this house cannot be sold to people of a certain race. Almost always black, sometimes Jewish as well. The reason for that was not what I would consider classic racism. It was property values. That people would say, well, the vast majority of my wealth is tied up in my home, and if black people move into the neighborhood, it's going to bring down the property values and it's going to negatively impact me. So we have a right as white neighbors to band together with this agreement and keep out black people. So this case went to trial, and distressingly, the Cockburns lost. It was found that the covenant was legitimate. They did stay in their home for some period longer because their lawyer had craftily argued that if this case went up on appeal, that the white neighbors would lose, and then more black people would come in. So he sort of used their own racism against them in that way. So what does that mean for the history? That means that things don't always move in the right direction. What does that mean for today? It put my antenna up a little bit more about what are we talking about when people say property values. Sometimes they're just talking about property values, but sometimes it's something else too, right? When you're talking about we're worried about too many kids in the schools or a burden on this or whatever, I think it doesn't mean that it's automatically racist. It doesn't mean that there's bad intentions. But I think it requires a level of scrutiny, that you need to just step back because there are patterns of this. And the neighbors are saying in the Inquirer, we're not racist. We don't have any problem with the Cockburns. There's no personal animus here. We're just worried about the value of our house, which, it's this sort of racially neutral excuse, which of course cannot be because of how it's impacting this family.
Yeah. Why did you decide to research the history of black people in Edgemont specifically? Like, why did you find that topic so interesting?
I found it interesting primarily because it had been untold. So there are books about this area, about Westchester and Scarsdale. There's an excellent book on Edgemont, which has a little bit of detail about the Stewart family. But by and large, this has not been a group of people that have been sort of sought out and amplified. In part because sometimes it's harder to research. So for example, in the older censuses, there's only tally marks to indicate there's basically the white man who runs the household is listed by name, and everybody else, the women and the enslaved people, are just tally marks. So it's harder to find out information, and it's sort of less satisfying. But it's important. And to me, it's also important in that, black people, the population, as you identified, was, 15, 20% back in 1790. In Scarsdale, same thing, 15%. So black people have always been in this area. Black people have a stake to this area. It's not a white area. It's not anything like that. So there's two things. One is just the historical interest. This is a story. It hasn't been told. I wanted to dig into it and tell it. And the other is, I think everyone should know that there's a history of many people being here, and many people, this was their home for a long time.
I know you've conducted a lot of interviews with people from this area who have stories to tell.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is like such an important part of your research, and how do you go about doing those?
So that was very powerful for me. I would describe that probably as life-changing. It was the most anxiety-producing part of it because, so look, I can do all the text-based research. I can look at photos and I can look at census records and things like that. But at the end of the day, for me as a white guy to be making a presentation on this without getting input from Black people who lived in the community, it rings a little bit hollow. And I very much care about getting it right. And so what I started doing, and this was, I was doing a lot of this research during COVID time, so it was all over Zoom. But I started cold reaching out to a few people, and they were gracious enough and trusting enough that I was going to try to tell the story with sensitivity and with letting them tell everything about their experiences, which were not all good, were definitely not all bad, were, as all human experiences, a mix of positive and negative about their experiences growing up in generally in Scarsdale. So I conducted basically 1 to 2 hour Zoom interviews with people. Those are all online, so people can see the whole thing, and then I excerpted bits of them to use in the presentation. But it was just fascinating and helped me understand what it was like for, say, mid-20th century for people to be moving into this area. Like, what did that take as a Black family to be moving into a previously all-white town? You're essentially a pioneer, willing for your child to be one of the only Black children in their class because you want them to have a great education and you want them to be in a safe neighborhood. You want them to have all the things that you can get from this area.
You've broken down the history that you've researched into sort of slavery, the rural era, and then the suburban, and then post-World War II. Why did you decide to break it down like that specifically?
So, it's not carved in stone. I feel like that was a useful way to think about it, just sort of the slavery era, to see how, in fact, slavery went kind of up, and then right before the end, it started going back down again. And then comparing the rural era and the suburban era was interesting because you can dig into who was here. So in the rural era, it's farm workers and farmers and so on, in the whole area, not just for Black people, for white people as well, although you had some estates. So who was here? In the suburban era, you start to see the surprising backtracking where Black people are being less welcomed, but you also see who's here. So you might see in mid-century, you see a rise in the number of Black people living in this area. But when you actually dig into it, you find that many of them are actually live-in domestic workers who aren't bringing their kids with them, sending their kids to the schools. But they're basically living in someone else's household, sort of away from their family. And so understanding that. So I just find it a useful way to break things up because these really are different eras in the time.
In the maps in your presentation, one of them included a comparison between Black ownership in the 1940s and present day. Is there anything that you can tell us? Why did you include that? How do they compare?
It was a striking discovery in that I took what somebody else put together from the census records, and then I also created a map today of, in those records, where do Black people live in Greenburgh? And you look at Elmsford, and you look at the river towns, you look at the Edgemont area, and you look at the unincorporated area in the middle. And what I found, to my surprise, that between 1940 and the 2020s, it was surprisingly unchanged. That where Black people lived in 1940 was consistent. And I don't think you would see that in other groups. I don't think that you would see that in Asian. I don't think that you would see that in Jewish or many other representations. So it's a little bit distressing that things are so durable in that way. And it led me to try to look into Why is that? Why are these patterns that were in place 70 years ago, 80 years ago, still existing today?
And what did you find through those patterns? Like, what were the patterns that you found?
So I can't necessarily say exactly why, but there's a few issues at play. So one issue in 1940 certainly could have been restrictive zoning, because that was not made illegal until 1948. And I know from my interviews that past the time that that sort of racial discrimination was made illegal, it still happened in practice. That we know that real estate brokers would steer people to communities where they supposedly felt more welcome, where white homeowners would not want to sell to people of color. We know that that happened as well. There's also a couple of other things. There's the enduring effects of intergenerational wealth, that Black people have less intergenerational wealth. It's harder to buy into expensive areas. And I also pointed out in another slide where zoning has permitted multifamily housing. Because if you can't afford a single family home on its own plot of land, you can live in places that have apartment buildings, things like that. Some communities don't allow their communities to be zoned for that, thereby keeping out people, and that's not necessarily racially intended, but it has that effect of people who aren't in the top, the wealthiest group, not being able to get into the community.
In present day, we also see on these charts what's going on here within the multifamily zoning.
Right, so you see in this one that in Greenburgh, where you have more multifamily housing allowed per zoning, you have greater populations of Black people. So areas like in the river towns or in the southern part of Greenburgh, where you have much less, you have in general mid to low single-digit Black representation. And areas where there's more multifamily housing, you have substantially more. So that raises the issue of, if you want to make changes, if it's important to you to have a diverse community in that way, this is one of the things that you'll need to address.
What can you tell us about this chart of the wealth decile?
So I thought this was important because the question that many people say is, well, we have no problem with having people of other races here. Why are there no Black people, or why are there few Black people in our community? Why is there only 2% of the population when the population of Black people in Westchester County as a whole is in the mid-teens? So there's a underrepresentation. And part of the reason is not a local problem. It goes to the wealth that people have, that in order to get into some of these wealthier communities, you need to be able to afford the mortgage and down payment on $1 million house and $30,000 in taxes going out every year. And you can see from the chart, as you get to the top decile, the proportion of Black people who have that much wealth is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. This is not something that a local community can easily solve. It's something that we should be aware of when we look at our tax code, when we look at the opportunities that are being afforded to people, that things need to be rectified if everybody is to have an equal opportunity.
Definitely.
Well, how do you get your kids into the best schools? How do you get them into safe communities, welcoming neighbors? How do you get your kids the best start if you can't get into them?
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much to our guest, Jordan Copeland, for joining us, and thank you guys for tuning in.
Make sure to join us next time for episode 3 of the GSNN.